My name is Gabe Newell, and welcome to Half-Life Alyx. To say this product was a challenge would be an understatement. It's our first Half-Life title in over 10 years, and it's our first one in virtual reality. In addition to it being a great VR experience that still felt like a Half-Life game, we wanted Half-Life Alyx to serve players who've been waiting to find out what happens after Episode 2, and at the same time, provide an on-ramp to anyone who hasn't played a Half-Life game at all. Ultimately, whether we succeeded in any of that is up to you to decide. But hopefully, this commentary mode will give you some insight into the set of problems we faced and how we chose to tackle them. To listen to a commentary node, pick up the floating hologram of a radio headset in front of you and simply put it on your head. Once you're done listening to the commentary, you can take the radio headset off or simply put on the next one. Please let me know what you think. I can be reached at gaben@valvesoftware.com. While I'm unable to reply to all the emails I receive, I do read them all, and they're a critical part of the feedback we use to evaluate our work. Thanks, and have fun.
As in the case of any Half-Life game, the first hour of Alyx must convey a lot of information to the player, hopefully in a natural and entertaining way. Players need to know who they are, where they are, what kind of world they're in, who the other important characters and factions are, and so on. At the same time, they need to learn how to actually play the game. How do they move? What can they interact with and how? What should they be trying to do, etc. Figuring out exactly what information we would try to convey in these first two levels, and how it would be conveyed, took us over 2 years of playtesting. It's tempting to try and include everything we think a player should know, but all information has a priority, and the more we include, the more chance there is that a player misses something important because they're distracted or confused by something less important. So over the next 2 levels, we'll use commentary nodes to point out some of the specific places where we grappled with conveying information to the player. In between these nodes, you'll likely be able to spot many other examples for players to find, if they're interested in paying closer attention and understanding more.
One of the pieces of important information we struggled to convey was exactly when Half-Life Alyx is set within the series timeline. Whilst we tried to reflect it carefully in many of the world details, it was never 100% successful during playtests. Eventually, we decided it was too important to be left to the players to figure out, and so we put it in our opening text crawl. The Citadel's incomplete state did provide us with an early opportunity to reinforce the timeline visually. Half-Life Alyx takes place 5 years before the events of Half-Life 2, in which the towering Citadel represents the Combine seat of power. As we see here, however, early Combine infrastructure is a cluttered mess of cables and unusual structures sprawled all over the city, surrounding the Citadel's construction, and served as a useful indicator of the time frame. We went on to reinforce this impression in other places throughout the following level. Combine architecture tends to be abstract in scale and form, so we included some familiar visual cliches of human construction: the large external scaffolds, some distinction of floor levels, rows of small lights, and the tidying of the silhouette into more structured vertical elements, try and strike a balance between capturing the alien nature of the Citadel whilst grounding its construction in enough familiarity to better understand its size and state. Large, sweeping vistas such as this one proved an interesting challenge in virtual reality. Their distance from the viewer means they don't benefit from stereoscopic vision the way that small close-up objects do. Because of this, the small objects on the balcony often draw the attention of the players before they've even noticed the imposing structure in the distance. If we moved the Citadel too close, it felt absurdly huge and difficult to take in. Yet placed alone on the horizon, it felt two-dimensional and flat. We found the solution in filling the space between the viewer and the distant structure with many scale references. The city itself, huge supply cables leading towards the vanishing point, large repeated Combine buildings, heavy pollution fog, careful lighting, and all the animated elements, especially the helicopter whose sound begins in the fade-in. All these were carefully composed to help draw the attention of the player to the Citadel first, before letting their attention wander to take in the details of the city, and settle ultimately on the inviting items here on the balcony.
In these first areas of the game, we grappled a lot with the density and prioritization of the information we were conveying to the player. Playtesting showed us that players in VR were easily distracted, often due to better peripheral vision, such that they'd focus on one scene element while losing track of others. This was exacerbated in these first rooms because players were acclimatizing to being in VR, often for the first time. In addition, different players progress at different speeds. We saw some players spend 30 seconds on the opening balcony and others 30 minutes. As a result, we did a lot of iteration over the set of opening areas, each time changing what information we tried to convey and where. Initially, the video call from Eli took place in the later refuge room with the snark and camcorder, but players were often too engrossed in interacting with all of the detail in that room to pay attention to the conversation between Eli and Russell. We moved the video call out to the starting balcony, but there it distracted from the establishing shot of City 17 and the Citadel. It also came at a time when players were still figuring out core game elements like movement and hand interaction with the world. That collision made simple things hard, like when to show the player a movement tooltip if they immediately started the video call. Eventually, we settled on inserting the greenhouse between the starting balcony and the refuge, which allowed us to move the call to an area with a slightly obscured vista and fewer interactable objects. This avoided the distraction problems and ensured players were past the initial gameplay moments of figuring out their hardware and movement setup. It also had the bonus of allowing us to add further detail to the opening balcony and Alyx's refuge without fear of creating distractions from the video call.
Alyx! How's it looking up there?
It's good, Dad. Metrocop movement is normal. Same for the Combine patrols. How's it going in the stockyard?
One Combine mini reactor from a shipment of 4,000. They're never going to miss it. Here, see for yourself.
And not only that, someone's hacked into the Combine construction network.
Don't get greedy, guys. We're not made of time here.
1 minute and I'm out, guaranteed.
Oh, also, I spotted the Combine moving supplies into the quarantine zone. That place has been deserted for years.
That is odd. Well,
What is...
well, we'll look into it when we get back.
What is this?
Meet back at the safe house, baby. We'll be there soon.
It looks like...
What is it, Russell?
What'd you... Terrific.
Beyond conveying critical information about the state of the world, the first two levels of Half-Life Alyx also needed to demonstrate some of VR's strengths. Conveying a sense of scale is something VR does much better than flat screens, and our early playtests showed us that nothing quite sold that scale more than seeing a Strider up close. In addition to the visuals, to fully illustrate the scale of a Strider at close range, we needed to do a lot of work on its audio treatment. Players had strong expectations about feeling the weight, power and presence of the Strider through its movements, particularly as it stepped on the balcony the player was occupying. In order to convey this power through sound, we layered multiple sound effects, allowing us to address ranges in the audio frequency spectrum and the temporal nature of those elements separately. We then combined those elements in the Source 2 audio engine to control them as one sound.
This room, internally referred to as Alyx's Refuge, was initially the location where the Eli video call took place. However, once that video call was moved out to the balcony, this room was freed up to solve other problems. In the Half-Life series, we've always tried to ensure that there's generally enough narrative for all players to understand where they're going and why, but for players who slow down and pay attention, there's more detail that can lead to a greater understanding. With the balcony being a place to get familiar with the game's inputs, the greenhouse being where the story kicks off, and the Strider there to surprise players with spectacle, we decided that the Refuge could be a quiet moment for players, where they could discover more narrative detail in the environment. At the same time, it could be a place where they can play around a bit more now that they're acclimated to being in VR. Spending time in the Refuge is meant to bring players into Alyx's role in the Resistance and her place in the world. We wanted it to feel like a real stakeout spot, where Alyx had been cooped up for weeks or months while planning the heist, doing research on the Combine. The camcorder, snark, and whiteboards are all toys that respond to detailed interaction and reward deeper investigation, giving curious players more information about the world of City 17 and what Alyx has been doing in it.
Alyx, are we good?
Yep, they got the reactor. Easy peasy. I'm headed back to the safe house right now to meet Dad. Go! We'll be in touch.
Stay safe.
Two critical pieces of information that we needed players to understand were simple to state, but not so easy to convey. That players were playing as Alyx Vance, not the Gordon Freeman they've played in all prior Half-Life games, and that Alyx is going to speak, unlike Gordon. These probably seem obvious to you now, but until we focused on them, it wasn't obvious to playtesters. Ensuring that everyone realized they were playing as Alyx was something we decided to hit with the biggest hammer we could, and name the product after her. But even with that, we were very careful in Eli's video call to ensure it's reinforced immediately. Olga, the character introduced here, was added to further drive it home by calling out when the player exits the elevator. Olga is the first character the player meets in person, and her dialogue here, and again ahead in the alley, is aimed at driving home the fact that she's conversing with the player, and that the disembodied female voice the player hears is Alyx speaking back. This was harder to convey in Eli's video call, because it already features Russell speaking off-screen, whereas in this scene, there's clearly no one else around in the conversational space other than Olga and the player. Without Olga, we found that, even though they had already spoken to Eli and Russell over the video call, playtesters still didn't feel like they were Alyx.
When we started Half-Life Alyx, we were very curious to find out how VR would impact our music design. The Half-Life series has always used music sparingly, often leaving the ambient sounds of the world to provide the audio background. But it is a tool we like to use to highlight moments where the world state has changed in some important way. In this case, that something's riled up the Combine. In our early playtests of this scene, without music, but with many of the other visual and audio elements represented, we found some players didn't understand that they should move along, and that others became distracted by the interactive objects in the laundry. We experimented with some very simple quote-unquote action music to communicate the changing of the Combine threat level, as well as the story's intention for Alyx to get to safety, and found that players were less likely to forget their quest and move towards their goal. The music was kept simple and cinematic sounding to allow it to blend with the purposely complementary background sounds and gently start to normalize the use of music in VR in a familiar way. This success encouraged us to use the same technique in scenes with similar requirements later in the game.
Alyx, over here.
What is it?
This doesn't seem like a routine sweep. Are you sure everything went okay?
100%.
Something's got the CPs riled up.
Keep your head down and be smart.
The remainder of this level is designed to continue informing the player about the world they're in, and to support the increase in the Combine's alertness. We also wanted detail to make the city feel alive, something that becomes much harder later on, once the player has a weapon. This was tricky to design due to the challenge we're often faced with, the friction between narrative state and gameplay state. Here, the narrative implies that Alyx should be making her way back to Eli as quickly and quietly as possible. But gameplay-wise, we're at the start of the game, and players are still testing the limits of everything they can see and touch. Unsurprisingly, playtesting showed us that some players would dedicate themselves to following the narrative and quickly move through the area, while others would completely ignore the narrative and explore every nook and cranny. While it's tempting to simply remove all distractions in an attempt to unify all players towards following the narrative, it would send the wrong signal about the density of our world and how the game intends to reward players for exploring it. So we spent months refining this section, adding, changing, and removing elements. We tried to find the right level of narrative tension, where players felt like they should be moving along, but not so quickly that they can't stop to tinker with something. We put in enough interactive objects and narrative moments where players were always rewarded for looking around, but we designed all those distractions to end quickly, so we could encourage players to continue moving along.
I just live here.
Probable anti-citizen. Keep those hands up.
Wait. Don't shoot.
You didn't steal anything. Don't care what you see. No one! I didn't see anyone! Get out and take him to transport.
Dad!